So today we're going to talk about what's an IEP, what's a 504, and we're going to also talk about tips for these kinds of meetings and school meetings in general. Out of all the things that people ask me about, wow, I get a lot of very granular, specific questions about IEPs and 504s and what they should have in them. And, the school said this and the school said that. And I'm going to tell you right up front, I've been doing this for working with kids with IEPs and 504s and private school kids with building plans. We're going to talk about that too today for my entire career of 30 years. And the guru in all things IEP is definitely my friend, Pete Wright. You can go to wrightslaw.com to get really the most useful detailed information about what you put in letters and whatnot. He's awesome. He's a special person. And if anybody saw my summit, he was our special guest and he was great. So we're going to talk about, all of these things. What is an IEP? What is a 504? How are they different? How they can support kids? And I am going to share with you the best information that you possibly can get right now. So what is a 504 plan? What's an IEP? People confuse them, and let's get into the nuts and bolts of what these things are, and I'll provide more detail. But at a top level, a 504 is exactly what its name says, accommodation plan. It provides for accommodation and supports things like extended time or access to the elevator or different things that we call level the playing field. An IEP is something that provides, it's a formal, these are both federal government initiatives to support people with disabilities. But an IEP, it has goals, services, and accommodations as well. So, which can be confusing for people. But let's get into what is an IEP. So an IEP is an individualized education plan, and it gives a student with a disability direct support. And the main difference between an IEP and a 504 is that under an individualized education program, which an individual education plan is written, it's that's a formal document where your goals and objectives and all the services you're getting is that you need direct support. Something needs to be remediated, and this becomes the bone of contention with everybody who's looking for an IEP, right? I recently talked to a mom, and she was talking to me all about, and it actually was a personal thing, so it wasn't even somebody who, was coming to me as a client. And we were just having a conversation, and, she was telling me how much money she had spent on pursuing an IEP for her kids who happen to be intellectually gifted and didn't qualify for anything, even though they have dyslexia. Their skills they were just straight A students. And so there's a lot of negotiations that have to happen. And it doesn't mean that those kids don't deserve supports, but where was the deficit? Where was it affecting their life? This really becomes the back and forth that becomes hard. In this case, I was like, you need an advocate, you need an attorney, and the amount of money you spent, you could have probably just hired a top-notch tutor and gotten the services yourself. I'm not saying that's the way to go, but sometimes as a mother of a dyslexic who's only, chosen to have private services for my kid and did a lot of the stuff themselves because I know how to do it too, that it's almost not worth the fight, but sometimes it really is worth the fight, right? So you have to have an area that requires a remediation, right? So an IEP, it then becomes this document where everything is put in there, your strengths, your needs, it has goals and objectives. And, it's individualized. I think one of the greatest problems with an IEP is that when you come to the meeting, they say, here's our program and your child's going to fit into that program. That's not supposed to happen. In the law, you're supposed to discuss the needs and then design an individualized plan. And sometimes it's an individualized program and your program might have to be modified. School districts, just because they present something to you doesn't mean it is the best thing for your child. But that document is really important. So a 504 gives equal access to people, right, in academic and employment settings. So an IEP ends at age 22. And this is federal. And then in a 504, it goes beyond. So it goes into college, it goes into your job setting, right? So there's lots of accommodation. So I had somebody who came to me many years ago in a job setting, and they needed enlarged text, and they needed to have extra breaks. So we had to do testing to substantiate that. And they got it in their job, and they were really a good employee, and their employer wanted it documented, and that's okay. So you can't just, and most colleges require formal testing, and it has to be current testing. So it can't be testing from first grade, just so you know. Some colleges will, I would say less than 5% don't require current testing. So it's that common that testing has to be accurate and has to be a reflection. It can't just be that they've had these supports all along and there's nothing new to substantiate it. So that's really important. But a 504 is very murky and gray. And so, you can have a diagnosis of OCD, pandas, and your district may fight you in wanting to give these services and supports to a child. Now, some states, so the federal law says you must provide accommodations, but some states, for example, Massachusetts, where I was trained 1 million years ago in the 90s, the early 90s, they actually give the same services most of the time to a 504 student as they do a student on an IEP. Can you imagine? That's why they're always rated as one of the top school districts, states to educate your child. So they will give services as well as accommodations, but that's pretty abnormal. And there may be some other states that do that, but I'm not aware. And so you're not going to get dyslexia tutoring. You're not going to get study skills support. That's got to come through an IEP. The question is, when does an ADHD child or a child with dyslexia or a child, whatever your clinical condition is, when do you go for a 504? When do you go for an IEP? And here are some questions you need to ask yourself. And this is important, right? So one of the questions is, you want to first say is, what are my child's strengths and weaknesses? And, I always like to say, pull yourself back, think about this a little bit, okay? And try to remove the emotional part. So, okay, my child's creative, my child is a good reader, my child is weak in math calculations, okay? Really get kind of granular and list it out in terms of, their whole part, right? And then, are your child's issues, their needs, causing them to regress or fall behind their peers in learning or social functioning? School districts try to ignore social, except for if you're on the spectrum. So that's really important. And then, has your child been receiving a lot of regular ed assistance or a 504 plan and are still behind? This is important in terms of the trajectory. If you can visualize, a graph where, kids start out at a young age, and even if your kid is really missing skills at a young age, they're still not going to be that behind. But then your normal peer trajectory goes up like a rocket, basically, sort of, right? An airplane taking off. And then your child is, a hovercraft, moving forward. And then that airplane just goes out. And that's really what happens when kids don't get what they need. If your child has received reading assistance in K or 1, they probably are dyslexic. And they may be very bright and compensating. I like to say that all the time is in there. So does your child have any kind of disability that's really impacting them, behaviorally, socially, in math and communication, in their coping skills, their executive functioning? Really start writing that down. And then, do you know that your child is missing skills that directly need to be taught? What are they, right? And you don't have to be a teacher. You could be like, wow, like my friend Jen messaged me the other day and said, we're sitting at the table and my son is crying, okay, right now. And, what was the questions I asked? I was like, does he understand the work? Is it the steps? Is it this? Is it that? And really what it boiled down to, it was they had a grade in their school. Their 5th grade runs like a middle school. So they have to go between classes. They have to be prepared at the beginning of the day for the entire day. I was like, well, hello, that's developmentally inappropriate. He's not the only one struggling. And so he was missing what instruction. That was really the base of it, right? So we talked about, in this private school, what a building plan could look like. They didn't even know any of that. That was even a possibility. I was like, oh, let's talk about that. And then in that case, right, it's a great example, understood the work when they were physically present, but when they're not physically present, they don't understand the work. So it's not an issue of processing and conceptual understanding. It was the executive functioning getting in the way, right? It was also developmentally inappropriate work, right? So I don't want to put it all on the kid, right? Because that's really, really important that we do that. And let's talk a little bit of difference between an IEP, a 504, and a building. So IEP and a building plan. So IEP and 504 federal initiatives to protect people with disabilities. IEP says you need direct instruction, right, in order to achieve at the same level of your peers. It's got a formal plan around it. You have objectives you have to meet. There's a very formal process in how you are tested. You ask for help from your school, and then ask for testing in writing. Sometimes the school tells you that they want testing, and it could be equally that way, but I'm finding more and more it's the parents like, hello, help me. And then 504, you would go to your school and say, my child has ADHD. He's having trouble sitting in his seat. He needs extra time on tests. I have a dyslexic. It's a private school. So we don't have a 504. That's a building plan. And, he doesn't get marked down for spelling. It's really his only area of weakness at this point is spelling. And it's pretty bad. It's phonetic though, so I get it. And he's very proud of it, and he should be, because man, he's had to work hard. And so in the case of a 504, it still has a plan. It's just different. There aren't goals and objectives. Teachers are told about the plan. Hopefully, usually the parents do. You don't have a case manager, an IEP, you have a case manager. And just please know that there's very little stigma in most places in America around special education services. It's not like when you grew up in the 70s and 80s like me, or 90s even. Things have really changed. Students of all kinds. I mean, even when I had students in the 90s, I had students that were National Merit Scholars that were on an IEP. So they're, having a learning disability or even a mental health issue that needs to be addressed is really no longer an issue. Right. So that's what that is. And then a building plan for kids with who have either of those. Private schools, unless they receive federal money, are not obligated to do a 504. So please know that. So if you're in a private school, Catholic school, parochial school, any other private school, I mentioned my kid has an accommodation, right? My school gives them accommodations. So most private schools, and I've done a lot of consulting for private schools, will allow for kids to have accommodations. They are not legally required in the same way, right? So, but I've never had a school that didn't, unless the issue, they said, hey, we don't feel that under good ethics we can support your child and you need to be in a different place. And I've had that conversation many times as a consultant in a private school. So I think that is important to know, that a lot of times we want our kids to go to a private school, but they may not be in the best, suited for it, right? So just some tips for dealing with schools, right? So number one, create your own agenda, people. Let them know. You can either give it to them the day in advance, you can give it to them that day. Here's what we'll be talking about in this meeting, okay? The best way to get the outcome in the meeting you want is to be in charge. Can you imagine me not being in charge of a meeting? I recently had a dad was like, you're going to take charge of this meeting. And I was like, I'm going to take charge of this meeting. They don't even know that I'm going to be in charge of this meeting. And it's going to be a love fest and we're going to get everything we want. And they were like, it was like the best meeting we ever had. I was like, I told you. So try to be pleasant if you can. But when you're dealing with these meetings, talk to your child. Like, say like, hey, in the case with my friend Jen, I was like, talk to him, ask him about this, that, and the other thing. And she did. And she got really good information. I mean, your kid may have communication issues, but if you can say like, what is it like? What does it look like when you're in Mrs. Smith's class? Tell me what it's like. Oh, it's so loud. It says you're going to get a different thing. You want to listen in a meeting. You want to be a good listener. Take notes. And examine and use data. You've heard me talk. If you didn't watch the other or listen to the other episode about how to testing in schools, you want to use the data. I don't care if it's standardized tests. I don't care if it's a spelling test. Bring it in, graph it, do whatever you got. Always ask. My kid cannot do X. What supports you have available? You will not believe what is available in schools. They often, maybe they're going to think creatively at the meeting. Maybe they have things you weren't aware. So it's always shocking. Parents are always like, I can't believe they had this, that, and the other thing. And you had to ask for it. And I was like, it's just the standard. Sometimes we just don't think like that. Always have a plan, right? So even if you're processing this out with your spouse or your mother, your best friend, an advocate, our team, have a plan, right? What's our plan? What are the action items, going in, and what are the action items that are coming out of this meeting? You're going to follow up. You're going to say, okay, so we're going to do this, this, and this, and it's going to be done by blah, blah, blah. You have to be in charge. If you're not bringing an advocate in it, you are your child's best advocate. There's nobody else that's better than you. And these are things that really can help you in a school meeting. So I hope this was really helpful. IEP and 504, that was the Cliff Notes version. You can definitely, I have some blogs. You can go to drroseann.com/my blog for some more resources. And certainly in our Facebook group, drroseann.com/group, Natural Parenting Solutions. We're here. And, we always support people in our Brain Behavior Reset program. You can go to drroseann.com/apply. But wherever you are in your journey is exactly where you need to be. And I know that having the thought of having an IEP or a 504, a building plan, can be overwhelming for you, but getting formal support in some way, shape, or form can be a game changer. So I hope this was helpful. Be well, everybody.